everyone, CVA here bringing you another video, and today I have a very special guest for you today, Mr. Danny Ledonne. And if you don't know who he is the creator of the Super Columbine Massacre RPG. Sir, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Hey, thank you CVA for having me. Let's get started.
Right on. So jumping right into the questions, when I think about your game, the accuracy of the overall picture of Columbine is extremely accurate. And I think a lot of people would like to know, where did you get all the information in making the game?
So it's worth kind of taking us back to around 2004. This was about 5 years after the Columbine shooting. Most of the hard facts were in, but there was still a lot of perspective that was yet to be gained that time inevitably gives us. So the game was kind of intended to help generate a little bit of that perspective using some of the primary sources that I had available to me. I filed an information request with Jefferson County Sheriff's Office and was able to obtain most of the documents that they had on file. There were some documents that your listeners may know, such as the basement tapes that were never really released in full to the public. And about a year after Super Columbine was released, Jefferson County made the final determination that they would not be releasing that material to the public, and they stated that it was because they were concerned that the threat to public safety outweighed the interest that the public might have in receiving that information, and they said that they feared that all future mass shooters would have a copy of the Columbine shooters' basement tapes in their possession, which may or may not be true. I'm not saying I agree with Jefferson County's argument, but I did feel a little bit conflicted at the time because this was around when the Columbine game became a national news story, and I wondered if I contributed to the fact that Jefferson County decided not to release those tapes, given that they probably had in their records that I'd requested the other material they'd already given me. I can't confirm that, that's just conjecture. But what I did was, in 2005, we were really at the beginning of what we called Web 2.0, but no one knew that that's what it would become. So, sites like Wikipedia were a good jumping off point. I found several reference sites like a columbinesite.com that had quite a bit of information, and there was a really interesting long-form essay by a guy named Douglas Ord. I think it's called Lear's Shadow, which is about Columbine, and it was kind of a literary essay that melded the story of Eric and Dylan's upbringing with some popular culture references like the Calvin and Hobbes cartoons, and then quite a few of the quotes and sources used in the game came from some of those interesting intersections. So it was really a conglomeration of materials I compiled on my computer. I created a giant notepad file that had all of these quotes from the shooters themselves and from other figures, and that became really like the primary research basin from which I put most of the quotes that ended up in the game, which largely consists of those primary sources.
Right. Wow. So how long did it take you to do all that? That must have been like a month or two project just compiling the data.
Yeah, so I've said in many interviews that the Columbine shooting never really went away because it had such an impact on my own upbringing as a young adult at the time that it happened. I was a sophomore in the Colorado high school at the time, not at Columbine, but I felt like it could have happened in my backyard because in some ways, it felt like a national news story that was about people my age in my own state. And I knew where Littleton was. I knew the Denver area well enough to really connect with it. And then subsequently all of the blame that was heaped on Marilyn Manson and the video game Doom and things like that made me feel like the real reasons for the shooting were not being honestly examined. So that's my soapbox. And
I love it.
That basically compelled me to think, well, if I'm going to make a video game, I want it to be about something that's important, something that matters. And so when I discovered this RPG Maker software, that's when the idea that this lingering sense that Columbine was not being accurately discussed or portrayed with kind of an honest good faith effort to understand what really happened and why, that a video
Oh,
game might be able to contribute to that. And so in about October of 2004, I discovered RPG Maker, and I started tinkering around with making a game about Columbine, and I started doing more of a deep dive into the research, some of which I'd already been, doing, but never in an official capacity. I would read articles, but now I was saving them. I used to look at images, but now I was downloading them, and I was compiling all of this into one common reference point and then weaving together a storyline based on the chronology of events at Columbine to tell that story, with the goal that the game would be released in April of 2005, around the would be the 6th anniversary of the shooting. And so I created a discussion forum, bought the website, uploaded after a few runs playtesting the game and sending it to friends to playtest, and then I uploaded the game in April of 2005.
wow. So did you think it was going to get this big? I mean, 18 years later, we're talking about it right now.
Yeah, so the game was released, I guess we're going on 12 years after the game was released, that we're talking today, and
Right.
I think about how, the ways that it's affected my life and shaped the way I think about media and the effect that it has on society. At the time, I had made quite a few films. I hadn't made a video game before. I haven't made a video game since. But it was an effort among many that I was making at that point in my life to communicate and investigate the world around us. So after my freshman year of college, I made a stop-motion Lego movie called Ship of Fools. And Ship of Fools is an adaptation of a short story written by the Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski.
Oh,
And
wow.
so for people who, tear their hair out and say, why in the world would Danny make a video game about Columbine? For me, just a few years earlier, I was trying to represent the perspective of, the primitivist Ted Kaczynski, and
Right.
railing against the system of industrial society and its future, as his manifesto was. So I wasn't just interested in school shootings. I was interested in kind of social deviation from the prescribed order and what we might learn about our own society from these dissident voices, and putting that
Wow.
into a popular medium context. So the idea that you could take a story by the Unabomber and turn it into a cute Lego animated allegory about a bunch of people at sea headed toward an iceberg, and everyone's in denial about turning the ship around, that's what that story was. This was before YouTube, by the way, so in retrospect, I think, well, maybe part of it was that I was making work that no one found before, and once the internet became more connected, people were able to find the stuff that I was doing, and it wasn't just on a VHS tape, it was on the internet for anyone to see. So, of course, I didn't anticipate what would happen, but I did know that it was controversial enough, and it was really my experiment with anonymity, with this idea that rather than authoring a piece with my name on it, like I'd done many previous times, to say what would happen if the internet, it just appeared one day online as this
Right.
kind of curious artifact that was this well-researched, kind of critical interactive essay about one of the watershed events of the late 20th century in America. And so the game was kind of framed as this internet object that one could interrogate, and I knew that it would probably upset some people, but that also might find an audience who wanted to discuss what it had to say, and I created
Right.
a forum on that basis. I had
Wow.
no idea that I would end up being discovered and doxxed, and that I would get all of this hate mail, and it would become a national news story in the Washington Post and all these other venues, and that then I would go on to become a part of the video game real-world violence debate that I made the
Wow.
game to critique. So I ended up becoming a part of a story when really if the game only existed online, I'm thinking about, would I ever have come forward on my own? The answer is probably not. I think if the
Oh.
game had just left itself alone on the internet without people trying to seek me out and expose me to like get the game offline, I would have gone on with my life. I was teaching. I was beginning to work on my master's degree. I was doing other film and video projects, running my business. So I had lots of things going on. I wasn't just like dying for attention from this game. So
Wow. So you're saying that if the when the game was released, you weren't gonna reveal yourself. You were just gonna throw it out there into the spotlight and then kind of leave it.
13 months. I was
Yeah.
anonymous for 13 months.
Oh
From
wow.
from April 2005 until May 2006, no one knew who made the Columbine game except for some of my close friends.
So
Um,
how did they find you?
well, so what happened is, and this is again, this is all part of the story of the early internet. I was paying for the hosting fees for the game to be downloaded, which usually was a few dollars a month. But once the game was featured in some semi-major news publications about a year later, it started getting much more traffic, and the site got 40,000 downloads in a day, and then the
Oops.
website crashed. Um, and so I put up a link soliciting for donations, and that was through my PayPal account. And I either just didn't think through or I hadn't tested to discover that, yeah, when you donate to PayPal, it would leave you with an email address that was then searchable. And someone did that and discovered my home address and started posting it all over the internet and
Oh gosh.
demanding that I would be that I remove the game or that some kind of harm would come to me was the implication.
That's
So
unbelievable.
in retrospect, this happens to people all the time now. It's called doxing, and it's done to celebrities. It's done to controversial public figures, politicians. I mean, Ajit Pai was doxed just the other day after the net neutrality repeal vote was happening. So this is a common tactic now, but this was all, my my freshman experience on the internet, learning how to deal with all of these kinds of machinations of public backlash and so today, you can send me all the hate mail you want. It's not a big deal. I'm a public figure. I'm used to it. It's fine. Um, and furthermore, the game is hosted on cloud services like Google Drive, so I don't have to pay for the hosting. But all of
Wow.
these things have been a learning process and an evolution. I certainly didn't go in with this kind of 10-year plan as to what would happen with the game.
Wow, that's the main reason I made the video talking about your game
Hmm.
was I felt a connection between me and you, and now yours is of course like 1,000 times more extreme than mine. But there was a shooting in Pennsylvania about a guy that his name was Randy Stair, and he was a fan of my YouTube channel. Not a fan, I can't say fan. He hated my guts, but he watched my channel. He used to leave comments all the time. I think I had to block him actually, but he did a shooting and killed himself, murder suicide. And in his final goodbye video, he said he mentioned my channel and how much he hated me, and he wished I did a face reveal so he could hate me more. I, I'd never talked to this guy. I had nothing to do with him. And after he killed himself and those people, I had a lot of people message me saying, I hope you, da 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 da, it's your fault. And I'm like, what are you talking about? So I kind of related that to your hate mail, and I was like, man, I should do a review of his video. And also, of course, the CVA Army requested that I do a review of your video, of your game. So,
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, and it's unfortunately a fairly common experience. We can probably
yeah,
get into this more, but the kind of disturbed person who is attracted to certain kind of media will probably consume a lot of it and in an obsessive way. So a number of school shooters have really obsessed over previous school shootings and all of the
yes,
media therein, which can include websites, videos, video games, etc. And it raises a lot of ethical questions about what we as media creators who are trying to understand these events should do to make sure that we're communicating in a way that we can at least state what our intentions are, even if
exactly.
that will be misconstrued by people who clearly, need help that they're not getting and make choices that we would never endorse.
Yeah, one big question I had for you is, Eric and Dylan, what's your opinion on them?
Can you be a little bit more specific?
So Eric and Dylan, meaning, do you think Eric was the psychopath and Dylan was the what should we say, depressed follower? Do you
Right.
think that stereotype is correct for them?
So that's the assessment that Dave Cullen gives in his book Columbine, that
Yes.
Eric was the psychopath, and that term is thrown out so often in popular culture that I don't think many people know what it means. So it's kind of worth understanding what psychopathology is, but that Eric had a certain kind of charisma about him, and that he had these leadership qualities that perhaps someone like Dylan came to admire, and that Dylan had his own set of mental health problems that um, included a case of depression, which I think in her subsequent interviews, his mom, Susan Klebold, basically confirmed. And it was interesting when she came forward, I believe a couple years ago now, listening to her side of the story, and where she connected some of those dots, and also where her family just did not see what was happening coming. On the morning of the shooting, while it was being reported live, Eric Harris's father, Wayne Harris, called into the 911 dispatch office to state that he believed that his son was involved in the shooting and that he feared his son may be a perpetrator of the shooting. And at that
Yes.
time, it wasn't known how many shooters there were. It was misreported that there perhaps were many more. There was just that kind of fog of war effect during the event where no one knew exactly what was happening. And we see this in many other shootings, not just at Columbine,
Right.
because it's just a disorienting experience. And a lot of people report thinking, I thought it was fireworks. I thought it was a movie. I thought it was a prank. I thought it was
Right.
a joke. Like the human mind doesn't necessarily immediately understand that they're under, attack in that kind of real way because they're in a setting that they're so normalized and that they feel safe in. So, just to go back, I think Eric and Dylan had aspects to them that most teenagers could identify with, and relate to. And I also think they had some pretty serious warning signs that, in retrospect, we might be able to see more opportunity for intervention. And I certainly don't view the Columbine shooting as something that was inevitable. There certainly were people who knew more that tried to come forward, and there were people who had their concerns but didn't come forward. And, there was also the possibility that they could have dealt with their issues in a different way and gone on to
Absolutely.
be, healthy, productive people. In at least one article that Dave Cullen wrote prior to the publication of his book, he basically argued that Eric Harris was kind of destined to be some kind of pathological serial killer, and that in some ways society got off easy because Eric was still too young to have planned out something in a more meticulous way. So if the bombs would have gone off inside the school, it was planned as a bombing initially, not really as a shooting. If the bombing had been successful, hundreds of people would have died, and the whole vision that they had was to wait outside the school and pick people off as they were leaving. And then when that plan failed, they just went in, um, and that was a really interesting, moment of decision, that there was this no turning back philosophy, and that the two of them together kind of kept one another in check to keep going forward. Whereas if the bomb failed, maybe they would run off, or maybe they would have second thoughts about what they were doing, they would be apprehended, etc. But it's one of the only school shootings where two perpetrators spent basically a year kind of planning this event, amassing and manufacturing all of these weapons and explosives, and basically no one else really knew the full story. The two of them managed to keep it a secret from almost everyone, and only in retrospect could we piece together where they purchased the firearms, an incident where they had been arrested previously for criminal mischief, for breaking into a van, and these incidents, in retrospect, might give us more insight than they did at the time, because Columbine used to just be a flower in a high school, and now
Right.
it's really known as a, and now it's known as the one of the worst school shootings, although the crazy thing is today, Columbine isn't even on the top 10 list for worst mass shootings in the United States.
Yeah, that's the most unbelievable part, you know. But when I was in high school, the word Columbine, it was a bad word. We weren't allowed to say it. If you said the word Columbine, they pull you out of class and hey, why are you talking about Columbine for? So but nowadays I doubt it'd be like that. 2017, almost 18. It's probably not the same.
Well, it is interesting that you asked that question. I can't sort of say with certainty, but I feel like talking about a school shooting today is a little bit like making a joke about a bomb in an airport. Because you can't, all those threats have to be investigated if there's any
Right.
degree of credibility. So even if it was a joke, even if were just mouthing off and you didn't mean it, um, we now live in this era where if you hear or see something like that and you don't take some investigative action, you're either kind of morally or even criminally liable for not taking action. And that's kind of unfortunate because there is a certain element of a chilling effect when you can't find ways to talk about difficult subjects, which
Yes.
became one of the underlying themes of my experience with the Columbine game is just this notion that there are some subjects that are off limits to talk about, at least, apparently with video games, right? If I told you that I made a documentary about Columbine, you would assume that it's something where I compiled all this evidence and primary interviews and put them together to say something of informational value. If I told you I wrote a song about Columbine, you might think that it was something where I was trying to understand the emotional impact of the shooting on the survivors or what caused these events to happen. But when I would tell people I made a video game about Columbine, the initial reaction was always just one of outrage and disgust because of what we think video games are. So
Right.
I could have gone on this after the game was released, I could have gone on this spree where I just created a new piece of medium about Columbine every week. Like this week I wrote a poem, and next week I made a short film, and then see, even if the underlying messages were very similar, how it was received differently because, as Marshall McLuhan said, that the medium is the message. So a lot of the intentions of the game may be lost in the noise because it's a game and not a book or something like that.
Right. Well, for speaking of myself, I'm very thankful that you made the game because I think it speaks to all levels of intelligence. I think everybody can understand it, and I think it brings down the message because, if we look at the top 5 books made about Columbine, they're all going to have a different message in it. So like Dave Cullen's book, for instance. Have you read his book?
I've read Cullen's book and I've read about three others. I haven't really devoted a lot of attention to Columbine since,
Right.
this period of time ending in about 2010. I would
Okay.
say after the 10-year anniversary, most of us who'd been studying it seriously, it was kind of time to move on, but I think the subject of Columbine is one we inevitably have to revisit because it shaped so much of how we think about rampage shootings today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, sir, I have one more silly question for you.
Yeah.
Conspiracies. Do you believe any of them?
Yeah, I mean, we're now living in an era of fake news and real news branded as fake news and conspiracy theories galore.
Yeah.
So it is always difficult now to determine what is true because one of the downsides to the democratization of the internet is that everyone has a website, everyone has a platform, and it is more and more difficult to determine what is credible. I think what I resented most were essentially the outright conspiracy theories that were advanced around the time of Columbine to further various political agendas, but that really ignored what was happening at the school.
Yes.
And so I don't know if you'd call it a conspiracy theory, but the politicization of Columbine to suggest that the shooting happened because we no longer have the Ten Commandments in school, or because we teach evolutionary biology in the science classroom. These were real concerns that were voiced by generally Republican politicians, but many in the kind of religious evangelical community that believe that the violence in our society is the result of turning our back to a particular religious interpretation of God. And we saw the same thing around media, the notion that we needed to be much more careful about creating music, video games, movies, etc., because they could turn a generation of young people into, serial killers or mass shooters. So I would say in some ways, one of the biggest conspiracy theorists are people like Jack Thompson, the attorney in Florida, now disbarred, who filed all of these lawsuits and spent the better part of a decade going after the video game industry with this allegation that they were murder simulators that were training children to become, serial killers, and that
Oh
that
gosh.
that, that video games like Doom and later Grand Theft Auto and Bully and games like this were causing violence that otherwise we wouldn't see in society. And those arguments have really fallen by the wayside. Almost in no recent mass shooting in memory do you even hear about the kind of media the person consumed or what video games they played. I think
Right.
we've clearly figured out most of us play video games the way most of us watch movies and read books. Actually, probably don't read books. We play video games and watch movies. And so as a result, it just isn't really a tenable defense.
Right.
Some of the conspiracy theories that I came across included the idea that Eric and Dylan were gay lovers, and that was forwarded in the movie Elephant with Gus Van Sant directing, and that wasn't an actual representation of Columbine, but it was just so close to being about Columbine that I
Right.
think many audiences walked away thinking, oh, this is Columbine and this is a true story of what happened, so, and there was a scene in there that implied that there was some um, sensuality between the two boys, and there's just not any evidence to support that. And what it ended up doing is furthering this notion that homosexuality is this deviant behavior that leads to other deviant behaviors like school shootings. And there's
Oh,
just, I mean, the hard statistics suggest that young people who are LGBTQ tend to have higher rates of self-inflicted harm just because they are feeling much more marginalized and bullied and made to feel like there's something wrong with them. They're not especially prone to lashing out against others for, those perceived wrongdoings against themselves. Um,
it's funny that you mentioned Elephant because Elephant and Zero Day, I'm struggling as a YouTuber to fact check because people are taking the suicide thing of Zero Day and making it Eric and Dylan's suicide video,
I know
and they're
exactly
posting it
what you mean.
online.
I know exactly what you mean because Zero Day was actually, I thought, pretty well made. The
Yeah,
idea of making a film entirely from found footage of the two shooters. I mean, after the Blair Witch Project, it was kind of bound to happen on that subject matter, and I actually am a fan of that film. I thought it did a good job. But of course, it was a fictional account, and way too many people have re-uploaded the last section of that film, which is a security
exactly.
camera video, and said, we have video. I mean, that's exactly what the problem with fake news is. It takes, to paraphrase Mark Twain, it takes much less time for a fake internet video to circle the world before we have determined what is true about that video. And it's not like the filmmaker ever wanted to deceive audiences into thinking that was footage of Columbine,
Right.
but that's just the end result of that theory. I will say that one conspiracy theory about Columbine that I'll dish on for just a second, not to say
Please
that
do.
I think it has credibility, but to say I encountered it, was the idea that Eric and Dylan were sexually molested or abused by the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office
Really?
when they were picked up about, I believe, 9 months before the shooting. Um, and
The
they were
January incident.
the
Is that
January
what you're talking
incident.
about?
Yeah. So, and I will tell you, I read a couple of articles that hypothesized that something might have gone on there, and then after I released the game, I put this nicely, a lot of the crazies come out of the woodwork when they see someone go public in a way that they think they might have an audience for their views. So I got a number of emails and phone calls from people in the Littleton area that had their own private views about Columbine that were not widely shared or widely reported. And one of those calls was from someone saying that they looked at some of the tapes and there was a reference Dylan made to enact some kind of revenge against the officer that he believed may have violated him in some way. And the theory was that the whole Columbine shooting was some revenge incident for what happened there.
Oh my goodness.
I don't think there's a lot of strong evidence to support that. In the same way that they did not have specific targets at the school who were the people that had bullied them previously, most of whom had graduated years earlier, but that it was clear they harbored an especially strong dislike for the establishment sort of hierarchy of the high school that included, the jocks and the cheerleaders and the popular kids. So there was some resentment there, but yeah, so that's one conspiracy theory that I came upon. I don't think it's very strong. And unfortunately now, in the advent of, specifically with Sandy Hook, but many of the shootings, this notion that it was a false flag, that it never happened, that we're actors and it's an entirely staged event like the moon landing that never happened. I mean, that stuff's just crazy. But
Yeah.
there is an interest in it, and I think we're seeing it right now still with the Las Vegas shooting from a few months ago, in part because, these are confusing and messy incidents where there's a lot of conflicting accounts of what happens. And when those accounts conflict, conspiracy theorists will say, you see, none of these people get their stories straight, so therefore it must be this elaborate conspiracy for something else.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
I think if we delve into it, we usually find that human beings are just not especially good recorders and reporters of what happens. So there will be conflicting accounts, different memories, different timelines, and there may
Yeah.
be
Plus a
some
little biased, right?
a
You know.
little bias. I mean, people
Yeah.
people see what they want to see in these incidents. We've had decades, if not centuries, of wrongful convictions, particularly of minority groups that one would find untrustworthy. So that must be the person that committed the crime, and they're going to jail even if there's no physical evidence that ties them to the crime scene. So, these are difficult situations to assess, but I don't think anywhere in the Columbine game will you find a conspiracy theory that's being advanced. You will actually find some cheeky references to conspiracy theories that I wanted to debunk, like the idea that Marilyn Manson influenced their decision to shoot up the school,
Right.
or, even one player later said that the fact that you can go up to the water fountain and it will give you the mineral composition of Denver's water supply and the public utility number to call for more information. That was just a weird little in-joke, but some players thought maybe that was to suggest that whatever caused them to commit the shooting, it wasn't what was in the water supply.
But okay. Well, from this point, I think we answered all the questions. Is there anything else you'd like to add, sir?
Yeah, I guess wrapping it up for your audience specifically, I think people who are interested in understanding complex or difficult events should consider using new ways of interrogating those situations and events. And that's not to say that everything needs to be a video game, but it is to say, think a little bit outside the box as to what and how you try to understand the world around you, because I think we can really benefit from some nonlinear thinking about how to understand events and activities, how to use firsthand information, how to use storytelling, how to use interactivity, how to use, poetry, art, music to engage all of our senses into better understanding the world around us. what I found appealing about the video game format is that it puts you in the shoes of the killers, and that can create levels of discomfort and reflection, that here I am as the player of the game, and yet I'm not the good guy. I'm doing terrible things to these unarmed people. Why am I doing this? Why would they do this? What brought them to the point where they did do this? That I am now reenacting something that really happened, and that I am authoring an event that has real historical significance, that it isn't just some escapist fantasy with, you know, superheroes or aliens or that kind of thing. So I hope people continue to go back and look at the game and um, remake it if they want to. It's an open source project, so anyone can get RPG Maker and tool around with it and discover new things, and continue to try and better understand, you know, what happened and why, and what we can do to perhaps prevent these things in the future.
Right. Wow. I agree with you 100%, and that's one thing that I try to take with my channel. I try to think outside the box. Of course, it's 99% all my opinion. You know, every discussion video I've made on the Curator's Corner and you know, Crime Video Archives has been my opinion. But I made the channel when it started. When the oh my gosh, what's the movie that just came out recently? I'm Not Ashamed. That's about the time that my channel started to kick off, when that came out, because I had a strong opinion against that. But anyways, thank you so much for coming on the show, sir. I really appreciate it. I'd love to have you back. If you ever want to talk about anything, please email me. We can make it a date.
Well, yeah, CVA, I appreciate it, and I'm glad we had this opportunity to talk. I hope your listeners enjoy. If they want more information, ColumbineGame.com has the game itself. I also produced a documentary to better understand this video game and the movement of video games that are trying to understand serious issues and games as art, and that is called Playing Columbine. Playing Columbine can be found on Amazon and iTunes and playingcolumbine.com. So I'd love to hear from people that have more to say, and I'm glad we had this opportunity to talk today. So thanks again for having me.
Absolutely. Those links will be in the description of this video, guys, and please leave some comments. I'm sure Mr. Ledonne would love to read them. So thank you very much for tuning in, sir. Thank you very much for playing around with me for a while, about 40 minutes, I'd say.
It's been a pleasure. Take care.